everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you a Victober video, which is essentially a very quick run through of my A to Z of Victorian literature. Mightn't be anybody else's A to Z, but these are just, I suppose it's a mix up of things that I associate with Victorian literature, the best things I like about Victorian literature, and a few other things as well. So yeah, A is for adaptations. There are so many of them out there, and I suppose the thing about for me is I actually haven't seen that many Victorian adaptations compared to, say, Jane Austen adaptations. And I think because there is so many famous works of Victorian literature out there yet that I haven't read yet, and therefore I've been holding off on watching the adaptation. But my personal favourites probably are North and South, which is of course completely wonderful, and also the Far From the Madding Crowd with Kerry Mulligan as Bathsheba Everdeen. I just love the adaptation, and they're just so beautiful, and just so many others that are on my shelf that I haven't watched yet. Middlemarch and Cranford and so many others. So yeah, just so much good stuff already watched, but also so much to look forward to. So B then is for Black Beauty. I've read this many times when I was younger, but I haven't read it, I'd say, for at least like 15 years. But it was a book that I really did enjoy and read a lot because I had my own copy. And I mention it here because I think it's the first work of Victorian literature that I did read. So although I don't remember it very well, I definitely read it before I read like Jane Eyre, or I never read like other children's classics of Victorian literature. Like I didn't read Alice in Wonderland until I was older, or like The Water Babies or anything. So yeah, Black Beauty is the Victorian classic of my childhood, which I didn't realise was a Victorian until recently, actually, until this year. I actually thought it was like Edwardian or something, but it's not. C is for coming of age or Bildungsroman. It's one of the challenges for this Victober, and so many great Victorian classics I think fall under this category. To fulfill the challenge for this year, I read Jane Eyre, which of course is like the seminal Bildungsroman. There's like lots of Dickens books like David Copperfield or Great Expectations, and I suppose loads of others like North and South or Wives and Daughters. They could all be classed as Bildungsroman, and it's such a great genre, I suppose, that really came into its own in the Victorian period. So we have Victorian literature to thank for that. D is for Dickensian. So Charles Dickens isn't an author that I always go on with. I really love some of his books, and I've been definitely cooler about some of them. But I think we can credit him for just having shaped our idea of the Victorian period and what it was like to live in it and the type of characters that inhabited it. Obviously Dickens has quite caricatured or like exaggerated characters, and like, you know, the majority of people were not like that back in the Victorian period. But I think if we imagine ourselves going back to 1867 ourselves and walking around Victorian London, we would like expect to meet some of his characters there. His books have had such an influence on popular culture that now we have the adjective Dickensian to describe like characters that are exaggerated, or like people that are dressed in like Victorian clothes. We'd say they're Dickensian. The lasting impression that he's had, I suppose. So E is for entry level. A lot of people think the Victorian classics are quite intimidating. So the entry level classic that I think I would recommend would be Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. So number one, it's quite short. Number two, it's by one of the Brontes, so you get the satisfaction of having ticked one of the books off your list and saying that you have experienced a Brontë book. Number three, although the plotline is more straightforward than other Brontë novels, I think it does like give you a really good sense of what you can expect from the other Brontë books in particular, and it deals with, you know, governesses, which are probably a relatively common theme across Victorian novels and the experiences they have. So yeah, I just think it's a good starting place and a very accessible classic. F is for Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This book deserves a special mention just because I really love it. I've read it like 3 or 4 times, and I've only read 2 Thomas Hardys, this and The Mayor of Casterbridge, but I have read Far From the Madding Crowd 3 or 4 times, and I think my love for it is just born of it being set in a rural setting on a farm, a woman in a man's world. I live on a farm. I wouldn't really call myself a farmer, but it's still nice to read a setting that is familiar to you. And Bathsheba is such an infuriating character at times, but I just love the storyline she has in the book, and as I say, the adaptation kind of has a special place in my heart as well. So got its own entry in the list for us in Mad and Crowd. G is for governesses. I suppose I'd be especially thinking of governesses in the Brontë novels. The Brontes were governesses themselves, kind of a fascinating type of people in that they were neither like servants or one of the family. One of the few avenues of work that was open to a woman to maintain her independence. As a working woman myself who would like to maintain my independence, you kind of do inevitably wonder, you know, if I lived in the Victorian period, would I have been a governess and would I have been any good at being a governess? Probably not, but it's still a fun avenue of thought and just the different experiences they had. Agnes Grey, I suppose, especially deals especially heavily with the topic of governesses. I suppose I should really say governesses teachers, you know, because I feel like that is a theme in the Brontë novels. So yeah, they get their own mention on the list. And again, I suppose governesses, although they've existed for a long time, if you think of a governess, you probably do think of one in the Victorian period. So yeah, Victorian literature has probably had quite a large part to play in that. H is for historical fiction. So I suppose in a way this could be grouped into two buckets. There is Victorian historical fiction, Wuthering Heights, Lorna, Doone or Vanity Fair, but what I'm thinking more is historical fiction that's set in the Victorian period. So much good stuff out there. The number one author I probably do want to read more of that's set novels set in the Victorian period is Sarah Waters. I still haven't read Fingersmith or Tipping the Velvet, and I've heard those books are really good. And part of me wonders if we hadn't had so many good Victorian classics out there, whether we would have so much good historical fiction set in the Victorian period. Probably a lot of authors that write in the Victorian period are fans of Victorian novels, so that's kind of fun, and Victorian literature probably kind of keeps the period alive for us a little bit. I is for investment. Investment in the terms of investment of time, in that a lot of the Victorian novels that we think of are quite long, like Charles Dickens' Bleak House and Our Mutual Friend or Vanity Fair, or even the Brontë novels. They are a bit on the longer side, but I do think that a lot of them are worth it. Like, you won't be guaranteed to enjoy all of them, but I do think you really get to know the characters really well, and often there are just so many characters that interact in so many interesting ways. So it's great that you can really get your teeth dug into the storyline and really inhabit the world of the book. So yeah, it is an investment in time, but often worth it. J is for Jabberwocky, which is a nonsense poem in Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, which is the second book in kind of Alice in Wonderland series. As I say, I didn't read Alice in Wonderland when I was younger, but I suppose it has a good memory for me in that one of the books that my mum did attempt to read to me, and I don't think it was even the original Alice in Wonderland, I think it was like an abbreviated children's book version, and she like couldn't make it past 3 pages. She's like, Lisa, this is absolutely nonsense. So I'm not reading any more of this crap. So yeah, it just makes me laugh. When I did read it when I was older, I could see that it was nonsense, but it was still really, really fun. Like, Alice is such a, I wouldn't even say that she's that much of a likeable character, but she definitely is funny to read about. Is one scene in one of somebody is like, oh, do you want to hear a story? And Alice is like, oh, do I have to? I've heard so much poetry today. So like, she's just so relatable in that way, and just, yeah, they're just really wonderful books. And I have heard that because I haven't read the annotated version, they're probably missing half of it, and I know already I'm missing a lot, so I'm probably missing stuff I don't even now know about, but someday I'll read annotated editions. Jabberwocky is such a fun poem, and there's so much other fun stuff in those books, including the illustrations. They're just so delightful. So K is for Knocknagow, or The Homes of Tipperary by Charles J. Kickham, which is an Irish Victorian classic. I read it 3 or 4 years ago. I can't say I remember a huge amount about it. And one of the things that stands out for is there is a game of hurling in it, which is kind of a sport indigenous to Ireland. And I've only come across it in one other book, and that's one of Patrick O'Brien's books where Stephen Maturin attempts to play cricket and he gets very confused, bless him, he thinks he's playing hurling. It's a book that I would definitely be interested in rereading now that I have read more Victorian literature, and I suppose it is unusual for Victorian literature that Charles J. Kickham was a noted nationalist and spent time in jail. So I would be interested to revisit as a more experienced reader. I do remember it being kind of quite episodic at the time, which sometimes can be disappointing if you're expecting something different, and I think that was my feelings last time. So yeah, would like to read it again. L is for London. Whenever you think of Victorian England, I think most people think first and foremost of Victorian London, and probably Charles Dickens' London. And I think because it features so heavily, like when I do visit London sometimes and you walk in like the older parts of London, you can kind of imagine Victorian London at the time if you just try and block out all of the cars and things. So that's just kind of fun, and London definitely is inextricably associated with the Victorian period. So M is for marriage, or the happy ending to many of the romances of Victorian literature. I think when I think of romantic classics, you probably do think, or I definitely think straight away of like Jane Austen, although I haven't read yet any Victorian classics that kind of deal with romance like as specifically as Jane Austen does, even though like obviously her books are about so much else. Like I can't think of a Victorian equivalent of like Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. But there are some great romances of Victorian literature. North and South, obviously such a wonderful novel, and probably does come closest. Or like Far from the Madding Crowd. There is so many great romances, and even if they form like a smaller part of the overall story. So they're always a nice surprise as well. Probably the favourite Victorian classic of mine where marriage plays a part is Bleak House. I just love the various plot lines around marriage in that book. It's brilliant. I've just mentioned it, but I'm going to mention it again, and that is N is for North and South. Like Far from the Madding Crowd, it deserves its own place on this list because it is definitely my favourite Victorian classic, and it's like in my top favourite novels of all time. But I just love everything about that book, and most things I love about that book I've mentioned separately in this video, so I won't dwell on it. But if you haven't read it already, North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell is such a wonderful, wonderful Victorian classic for anybody. I was going to mention it as one to start with, but it's just that bit longer, and sometimes a long classic isn't where you want to start. So O is for own. I do own quite a few Victorian classics, but I wanted to talk about in this one the ones I own but have not read. So the Victorian classics that are on my shelf that I haven't read yet are Mary Barton, Tess the Durbervilles. I have Trollope the McDermotts of Ballycloran. I have 3 more Trollops, which are the 3 last Palliser novels. I did read the first half of that series probably 2 years ago, and I just stopped halfway through, so I have to pick up that again. And also I have 2 books which include that story, and they both include other things as well, but I haven't read those yet. I also have the full bind-ups of the Sherlock Holmes short stories, and also I have a book of Victorian poetry which I'm reading for this Victober, and I haven't yet read Bob of the Battle, which I'm also planning to read this Victober. So that is all of the unread Victorian classics on my TBR that I own physically. P is for progress. I think this is such a great aspect of Victorian literature and why it's such an interesting period for us to read about. It is in the past, but it's close enough to the present. I think that the world is starting to become a lot more recognisable to us in terms of industry becoming much a bigger thing in the Industrial Revolution, and transport, trains, ships being more accessible to people. One of the things I suppose you'd even notice in introductions and things is when there's like a bit of a debate about when the book is set. They will often talk about, if the characters use the train, or where they're going on the train, was that line built yet, etc. So that's just a fun little thing. And obviously North and South, another mention. I just love all of the ruminations of like factories and that. Shirley also deals with kind of progress in that kind of way, and it's just a really great theme in Victorian novels. Q is queue of books to be read. So yeah, these are one of the more difficult letters. What can you do? But in all earnestness, I was making a list of all the Victorian novels I have read, and I actually, I'd read a respectable amount, but there's still so much out there. Like, I only finished the Brontë books last month. I've read about half of Dickens. I still haven't read some of Elizabeth Gaskell's books. There's so many things still for me to read, not to mention like Anthony Trollope. Even when I finish the Palliser books, I'll still have the Barchester Chronicles to read. So yeah, it's just so great that although it can feel a bit overwhelming, but there's so many great Victorian classics that you would like to read. You keep hearing about more and more obscure ones that sound great also, but that just means that you'll be entertained for many Victobers to come. So R is for rereads. I'm a big rereader anyways. I love rereading, but I find that Victorian classics are especially rewarding to read, and I actually think, as awful as this is to say, I would rather reread a Victorian classic than read a Victorian classic for the first time. Sometimes spoilers aren't that much of an issue for me, and I think it shows when I say that sentence, but like I find when I reread Victorian classics, I enjoy them more and more every time. Like a case in point would be Villette. I reread that this year and I just loved it so much more than my first read. Although I had enjoyed it on the first read, I just loved it on a reread. I've read Bleak House like 4 times, I think, and every time I read it I get more out of it. I just love it, and you just get more and more invested in the characters, and I just love returning to visit them. So yeah, like when I think of my next Charles Dickens read, like, I know I should read another one, but I would love to read Our Mutual Friend, which I enjoyed the first time. I feel like I get more out of the second time. And A Tale of Two Cities, which I think I had a bit of a lukewarm reaction to, but I feel like I'd enjoy it more the second time again. So yeah, I just love rereading Victorian classics, which is a problem given the last thing I said about the queue of books to be read. So S is for a very specific thing, and that is 70 times 7. And it's funny, when I was thinking what I'd put for S, like, this jumped into my head straight away. For Leaving Cert, we were required to study one novel, and the novel that we had was Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. And I think this is probably my favourite section of the book. I just find it so funny for some reason. Lockwood, one of the main characters, is put to bed, and he says, "Alas for the effects of bad tea and a bad temper," and he ends up having such bad dreams, of course, including quite a famous one. But before he gets to the famous one, I love that he's dreaming that he's in a church and this clergyman is preaching to him, and he's dreaming that the clergyman is given a sermon that's divided into 490 parts, each fully equal to an ordinary address from the pulpit, and each discussing a separate sin. It's just so funny. Imagine that sermon. And it gets worse as to what the congregation start doing. I just love that part of Wuthering Heights. So 70 times 7 is from a Bible verse, I think, which is about forgiving your neighbour and how many times you should forgive him. So T is for Thorntons, again related to North and South. So I love Thorntons, and I love the Thorntons. Thorntons, the mill. I love reading about the workers and the issues that there are with strikes and things, the ups and downs of the actual business, the kind of different welfare things that are put in the different mills. I just loved reading about the cotton mills in North and South. And then Thornton himself, like, I mean, what a great main character. And just their family dynamics, like John Thornton, the like self-made man, his sister who's kind of quite vapid, and then like really stern mother who just like adores her son. She thinks the world of him, and like she's the complications of her character. I just love reading about the Thorntons in North and South. So U is for unfinished. So the main unfinished book I'm thinking of is, of course, Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. It's missing like just a chapter or two, and you know where it's going. You just don't get that satisfying ending. And I suppose the other author that kind of left unfinished work behind them was Charles Dickens. I haven't read The Mysteries of Edwin Drood, but definitely those unfinished novels, especially the former Wives and Daughters, they kind of do have a big place in Victorian literature for unfinished novels. So V is for Vanity Fair. I'm mentioning this as it was a new discovery for me this year, and I really loved it. A long classic, but the main character, Becky Sharp, is so memorable, and I love that it's set in kind of the Regency period, although it was a Victorian book, so kind of the look back on what they thought of that was just really interesting. I still haven't seen the ITV adaptation, but I really would like to. So W is for Woodcourt, Alan Woodcourt from Bleak House. Honestly, again, just one of my favourite characters in Victorian literature. I just love how nice he is. I'm very basic. I just really like really nice, self-sacrificing, good characters, and Alan Woodcourt is definitely one of those. He's a doctor, so he always kind of comes into the scene kind of when you don't really expect him to, like, he might be visiting the less fortunate, or like there's a very memorable scene where somebody is reading about something that he's done in the newspaper, and yeah, he's just such a hero. Who wouldn't love Dr. Woodcourt? So X is for xenophobia, obviously a big part of Victorian literature, as they are books that were written a long time ago when people obviously didn't have the best kind of ideas, you know, of people from different cultures or different religions or different countries. And sometimes when it comes across it in Victorian literature, it does kind of irk you a little bit, but you just need to accept it, I think, and hope that we are better now. So penultimately, Y is for young, and my favourite young character that I've come across in Victorian literature is definitely Jenny Wren from Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. She is such a wonderful character. I don't think it's specified what her age is, but I always kind of imagine her to be about like 8 or 9, about that age. Her father is an alcoholic, so the parent and child relationship are kind of swapped. She calls her father her like bold child, and when he comes in drunk again, she'll be like scolding him and be like, "Where's your money? Don't be spending on drink now." And she's a doll's dressmaker, that's her job. She does great pride in it, and she seems to be good at it, so she's great to read about for that way, and yeah, even just the drawings of her in the book, I'll put one or two of them on the screen. I just love the way she's portrayed with her father, and yeah, I just love Jenny Wren. Like, she actually is one of the reasons I would like to reread Our Mutual Friend. I also have an adaptation I haven't seen yet, so that is coming up for a reread. It might be on the list for next year, you never know. And Z is for Zillah. Thank goodness for Zillah, because I was quite stuck on what to put down for Z. I did remember Zillah from Wuthering Heights. I remembered she existed, but I couldn't remember that much about her. So I had a quick Google, and I think poor old Zillah, the thing that came up first in the notes was there is like, Zillah refuses to help someone when they move into a house. Like, what a lovely thing to go down in history for, just refusing to help somebody. But she also shows Lockwood to his room on the night where he has those bad dreams, so we have her to thank for those wonderful sequences of events, 70 times 7 and the dream after that. So yeah, Zillah did contribute to Wuthering Heights quite a lot, probably more than I remember, so yeah. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this somewhat silly little video. It's something I did want to do for Jane Austen July, I didn't get to it, so I'm glad I got to do it for Victober, and I think it's something I could update after a few years when I've read more Victorian literature, please God. So yeah, thanks so much for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.